Alafia, and we're live. Thank you so much during our segment of sessions. All of this is following up under the Heroes Teacher's Pet. Make me your teacher's pet. And we're talking about today the effects that females have on black males. This is part of my research and studies. The book will be coming out. The manuscript is all completed. We're doing the cover of the book, but we have been having debates and discussions because the book is a little controversial, and I will say for the record, for some of you teachers, you might be denying if you're part of the conspiracy. Dr. Jawaza Kanjufu and I once talked about that there were conspirators and conspiratees, and we were fishing around for who were the conspirators that were involved in the effects that this had on the black boys. So his whole topic was on the conspiracy to destroy black boys. And he came up with the fact that if there's a conspiracy, there had to be two people involved. And I sought out to do research for over 15 years now. I said 10 earlier, but I'm still working on the last chapter. And in trying to create a workbook, I wanted to show that this conspiracy had something to do with the females that are 80% in the profession of teaching, that the females closely had something to do with being a part of the conspirator to carry out the conspiracy. So what am I saying, Sherelle? I've been on many radio stations to debate this, so I don't find it strange that you're questioning me. I have actually appeared in some of the conferences where I've been debating other people in reference to who I claim that the conspirators are. And as I wrote, the effects that females have on black males, and there's also an add-on coupled with their culture. Because even if they don't hate the black male, they may hate the culture that he represents. So my standpoint on the whole thing was the effects that they have on black males. And what are the effects that I'm referring to is that a lot of these boys end up in special ed who cannot be controlled in the classroom and who might become problemsome and quarrelsome to the teacher. Instead of her dealing with the problem, she sentenced him to a life in special ed and mandates that the parent signs him off there and also recommends him to be medicated. And there lies what I want to talk to you about today. And parents, I want you to hear me good, because just because a teacher or an administrator recommends medication for a child and recommending that the child must be medicated in order to stay in their classroom, that is not a final death sentence. You do have a choice of who you want to assess your child, and it could be an independent assessment. It does not have to be an assessment from the school. And remember, this is a value judgment. This is not an indictment. And you must also remember this is an observation of BD and bad behavior. And usually when this observation is done, there must be also a medical exam, like an EEG, for example, to determine the brain waves. And if you do not do an EEG, it is not a conclusive test of just the observation. Because if we know what bad behavior is, then we must know what the norm is, and no one has been able to define the norm of behavior. At least in this lifetime, they haven't. Now, most mothers who get that phone call that their child is acting out, being defiant, they get that phone call with an urgency that you must take your child to a psychiatrist, and we have a list of those psychiatrists, and you must have your child tested, and you must have him medicated before he can come back in this classroom. And in the meantime, they sentence him to a life of special ed. Most parents think that they're going to do something for their children in special ed classroom that's miraculously magic, and that overnight he's going to be changed once they give them this prescribed drug, which is usually called Ritalin. And Ritalin is a drug, and it is a stimulant. So therefore, in putting your child on this medicine, it is going to affect the brain waves. And you must understand there's a synapse that carries the messages of the brain from the right side to the left. And if it's not fired up properly, that synapse does not have to carry that information over rapidly enough, and it causes a minimum brain disorder. So they prescribe this as a minimum brain disorder, and sometimes they give it a catchy name, attention deficit with hyperactivity and without hyperactivity. Now, my research started because I spent years in the system working with so-called attention deficit disorder boys who nobody wanted, and they put in my classroom. So I began to look at what is different about these boys and why did no one want them, and have their parents actually written them off too. I discovered that most so-called attention deficit disorders is not a pure case at all unless an EEG has been done with this prescribed order. And most psychiatrists will tell you that I don't usually recommend behavior therapy to Black African Americans because they don't do well with behavior therapy. They mostly do well with drug treatment to control their the impulsivity. But when I then spoke to one of the psychologists, I said, well, how would you know? Do you have extensive tests and long time examining African Americans in any file or research you've done that showed over a period of time how well does that African American child do with behavior modification? She didn't have the statistics because the research hadn't been done. She just didn't want to fool with putting African American males that are Black into therapy classes because they didn't think that they would fare well. This is just their assumption. However, any type of behavior is learned and it can be unlearned. Now, most of where this topic came from, I had concurred with Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu about the conspiracy to destroy Black boys because we had a problem in a school district that was predominantly all white in the northwest suburbs where these Black boys were being identified to be tested and assessed for a disability. What that disability was, they hadn't defined yet. But there are many disabilities, and you have to define one in order for them to qualify for a disability. And most of these teachers got away with using attention deficit disorder, can't stay on task, cannot focus, and is multitasking, doing too many things at once. Well, I find that those are some gifted areas if you can multitask, because teachers do it all the time. So I began to question this condition called attention deficit disorder. Was it real? And why were they getting so many Black boys tested in this area? And when it came to me, when I was teaching and had young children, I was also asked to have my son tested, who transferred in to the public school from a private school setting, who had had no problem whatsoever in the private school and was doing fairly well. I said, well, why would he need to be tested? Is there any indication? Oh, no, we just want to make sure he's a big boy and that he's going to do well. And I said, well, look, I would never give anybody permission here to have him tested. And if I thought that he needed tested, I'm a teacher. I can take him in to my own choosing of psychologists and have that done, but I don't see the necessity. Well, that's what did it. When I decided to refuse them, they thought I was defying some type of slave law or something. But nevertheless, I was advocating for families in the community that were having this problem, and our district was having an overwhelming problem with large sums of 7 and 8-year-old black boys who were being recommended for testing in the school district in the school district where it was a peerless, clean school district of whites who suddenly started getting an influx of large sums of black families moving to the northwest suburb. They wanted these boys tested. They wanted them out of the mainstream. So we as families fought back. We fought back, and we brought a claim against special ed department, and we also fought back and brought Dr. Jawanza Kanjufu in, claiming that these teachers and the district need to be sensitized to working with black boys. So we mandated that they allow us to bring in conferences and workshops through Dr. Jawanza Kanjufu. And he brought them in. And at that time, I was not in grad school, but I never forgot what Dr. Jawanza Kanjufu did for our district and how we turned things around. So I always vowed that I was going to research the topic of who were the conspirators. And Dr. Jawanza Kanjufu and I talked about it extensively, and I told him I was going to challenge this topic that had never been addressed. And even my professors say, you are a bold one, and I commemorate you for standing up and wanting to speak out on behalf of this particular topic that has not been addressed by any of the graduate students that I have taught. So he applauded me in what I was doing. He did not frown upon it. He said it needs to be addressed. So Dr. Jawanza Kanjufu agreed that he would read through my document after I completed it. He did not say he was going to publish it, but he did ask me if he could publish it. He was rather impressed with it. I was then transitioning abroad and wanted to take it with me, so I decided to publish it myself, and thanking Dr. Jawanza Kanjufu for favoring the document and supporting it. At that point, I started to participate in debates, and I started speaking at various different conferences on behalf of my hypothesis. And that I believe that over 80% of the teachers who were teaching in the profession were females, then it was quite naturally and stand to reason that the majority of the teachers who would have an effect on black males would certainly be the females, because they were the greater number who was teaching in the profession. So I made an indictment against my own race of females, and white and black alike, that we had something to do with these boys being recommended and forwarded into special ed, because many of us had written referrals before, even myself. So I was putting an indictment on a group of women to take a closer look at themselves and see if they could have misdiagnosed some of those young souls who ended up in special ed, who happened to be black males, minorities, and Hispanic. And with that indictment carried some type of feeling with it. But nevertheless, it had to be addressed, because I'd never seen so many black boys that were sentenced to special ed. And I later found out from several different other authors that because there was no longer a law that said that you can discriminate through segregation in the public school, but it did not negate the fact that you couldn't separate those black children within the school building, such as sentencing them to special ed. And that's when I knew then that they were using the special education for segregation, because they took the black boy out of the mainstream and he would not get the same education that the other school children got. He would not be challenged, and he would, in fact, be given a lower criteria to perfect his skills, and therefore he would not be challenged to be a recipient to make an application for college because he was not a part of the core 40. That, in my book, was discrimination. It was a sentence. And then I later found out through other professionals it was a direct route into the penal institution, that a lot of those young boys who were sentenced to special ed, who stayed there up until their high school level, never made it out of high school in special ed, but matriculated into the penal institution. So I then began to wonder, what is this problem? The problem is we needed more advocates, like I was proposing to do, who could advocate on behalf of these black boys who were being misdiagnosed and placed in special ed. And the reason why I know that, because most of them were not being given the benefit of the doubt, where they were being given a behavior modification to address this so-called attention deficit disorder. None of them had had EKGs that I knew of, and none of them were on a behavior modification with the psychiatrist. They were just being treated with drugs, and drugs only. And I was always taught you cannot give psychotropic drugs to anyone without a behavior modification to change the behavior that you want to turn around. So I knew then it was a death sentence, and it wasn't an intent to correct their behaviors. And as anyone might know, that psychotropic drugs will affect the brain, and it will affect the body, the listlessness and inability to eat because of losing appetite and all of the side effects that go with it. So my heart tore for these young boys who were sentenced to these elaborate sentences in special ed, who were medicated. They lost interest in things. They did not have a desire. They were listless, and it did not make them sharp and on their feet and at the top of their game. And a lot of them who were playing sports no longer had an interest in sports, and I knew that they were slowly dying inside. So I had ventured out to write this statement paper, and to write it from a perspective where I looked at infant children and looked at the core of the infant child at its height at zenith from Africa as an infant. What were the children like, and how in comparison were they like African American children? And when I was told, when you spill the guts of an African in Africa and you took the Westerner African and spilled the guts, there was no difference. Their intestinal flora was the same. So that told me that when I examined these African infants and toddlers and saw that they had the ability to thrive, they had the ability to coo, and they were talking much faster than the Westerners, and they had a grip that they could grip the hand, and they had the ability to sit up sooner. They also had the ability to crawl and then to stand and hold things, and they had good eye-hand coordination, meaning that they were developing much faster than the Westerners. But what happened to the Westerners? When they were no longer challenged after kindergarten age, they started regressing because they were no longer being challenged, and they slowed down in their progress in the Westerners' world. So were we retarding our children or what? And were they regressing for the reason that we were no longer challenging them? So what I want to say is I did a job of doing the developmental stage because my background being early childhood development and family life, I had to look at the lifestyle of the infants and toddlers in their environment in Africa as well as in the Westernist world. And to my dismay, Dr. Ames was also researching African children. She was rather obliged to find out how much more advanced the African children were than the so-called children in the Western world. And she looked at why was the African Americans regressing when they started off at the same podium of the advanced child development. So that came to my mind that somebody had to be retarding the curriculum, causing the children to regress and go backwards. Now, most African children learn in a cooperative style, in a communal style. That's why they don't leave anyone behind, because they go back and teach that one that may not have comprehended, and everyone progresses together in a cohesive communal style. So why were these black boys failing? Why didn't they get together and teach one another? Well, they didn't get a chance to, because cooperative learning style was not an actual method that was being smiled upon by the American so-called curriculum. So therefore, you do your own work, you work independently, and the Africans' technique, they didn't understand that because they were used to working in a group, and if I see someone falling behind, I must help them, and I cannot go at this alone, and I must help my brother pull his bootstraps up. But nevertheless, I made this indictment, and I said, yes, all of us women are responsible for these black boys going to special ed. We're not trying to understand them, and before we can get an understanding of their nature, that they're rambunctious in nature, and that they're rather louder than the average group of racial people, and that this is the way that they function, with loud, imitating sounds and noises, and rambunctiously engaging themselves in kinesthetic learning, because they are hands-on and they learn through their melanin. Because we didn't have this information before us, we thought that we should compare them to the white boys and girls who were always sitting quietly for a story, because in their homes, that's how stories were presented, and they knew not play with loud noises and making sounds while they were engaging kinesthetically in play. They could not be exceptionally physical in their play with their other friends, because it was going to be held against them. Nevertheless, the environment for black boys was quite different from any other race, and no one picked up on that. And because I have had boys that I reared, I knew the protocol, and I learned to accept some of the noise. So superintendents and principals would notice that my class was exceptionally loud when it was free play. And I had to explain to them, they're just enjoying themselves. And principal said, well, could you keep the noise down? And instead of taking away these boys' opportunity, I had 16 black boys in my classroom with very few girls. And I decided to take my children to the gymnasium every time we had free time, so they can talk as loud as they want, and they can enjoy themselves and put their whole bodies kinesthetically into it. And that's how we ran our free time in the gym. They could pick up, and their brains could bypass the brain for learning. Their brains could bypass the brain, and their hand could become a brain to learn from. I began to study Dr. Carroll's research on melanin and what melanin actually does for the body. And is it a byproduct just for color? And through Dr. Carroll, I learned that melanin was more than just a byproduct and that it was an actual brain. And it could function as a brain, bypassing the real brain, left and right side, occipital, temporal, and that it could be challenged through the arms and the body because there was melanin in the hot spots that these children would use the melanin to comprehend about what kind of toy they were handling, what could the toy do. It would transmit the information to the brain. This is a study that I think is so profound that you could bypass the brain and go straight into the hot spots of the child where they can learn through the melanin in their body. Melanin has to be taken in consideration of how Black children learn and that they are different and that even their chemical makeup of their fluids are not of acid but of alkaline, heavily alkaline bodies. Whereas you can give a certain drug to an African American that can kill him, whereas the Caucasian can tolerate it. Now, this is why I'm saying that the salt contents is even different in the body. So I then consulted Dr. Lyola Africa in doing my research to talk about the body fluids, the adrenal gland, and the makeup of the Black chemical body of the African boy. He then told me it was very different. It is not the same as a Caucasian, and there are things that are made up in our body that we have the ability to sustain ourselves and make antibiotics to fight off diseases. There's no disease that the African American body cannot build up an antibiotic to. So are we looking at our bodies in a way that melanin can be a cure-all for not just the Black race, but for many other races as well? So herein lie a whole nother category that I hadn't even considered, the allopathic alternative measures to treating the Black symptoms of diseases. Just like when we talk about giving the body various different flu shots or immunization shots to prevent diseases. The African Americans don't need all those various different injections because our bodies make up enough enzymes to fight off certain diseases. So therefore, you can be over inundating a Black child with these vaccinations, causing other diseases to come about because their body is already quickly making these antibodies. Now, am I a scientist? No, but I have a science background in a minor in science, taking pathology, anatomy, physiology, chemistry, and the healthcare courses up to 62 hours of healthcare. So it gives me a foundation to speak from, not only because I've worked in a pathology lab as an intern and have worked in the diner's office doing autopsies, so I've had some exposure to science and understand how the bodily fluids work in the body and understand the 206 bones of the body and understanding how to work with the cadaver and looking for the tendons in the body. So I have had some exposure, so I can speak intelligently on this topic, being a science endorsement teacher to teach science. So what I want to say is that my research will prove that, in fact, we are dumbing down the curriculum of the African American male child. We're dumbing it down because they can learn at a much more accelerated rate than what we propose. We are retarding them and slowing them down in the classroom. And if you teach with a rapid ability, you can hold their attention and teach more than one discipline at a time. You can cross-train and teaching them to keep their attention. They are so sharp that they have already figured out the problem while you're just introducing the lesson. The children are not dumb. They have language barriers. And a large percentage of these children that have been placed in special ed, they have an ebonics problem with a language deficit, and they should have been assessed for language disability and placed in speech or placed in language classes to get their language ability up. So a language deficit could be mistaken for a learning disability. And what I want principals to know, you need to reassess your special education department by creating a staff of teacher aides that will come in to help you retest those children in the special ed and find out those misappropriate students who have been misappropriately placed there and place them back appropriately in the language classes, which they should be. And we have a whole outline program specifically for self-testing for those schools and principals who would like to participate. We like to help you empty out those special ed classes and get those children placed back in their appropriate mainstream classes and get the help they need for language and reading. 9 times out of 10, when you solve the language and reading problem, you solve the special ed deficit. More than likely, half those children that are in special ed have never been taught to read, and they're not ignorant or unintelligent. It's just that they have not been taught a foundation for reading. Some of them are dyslexic, and they read everything backwards, and they must be tested for dyslexia, and they must be retrained in the area of language and reading. Not a learning disability. A learning disability would mean that they have a deficit in the brain somewhere. And when we say attention deficit disorder, there's no true indication of that either, that it exists. But we know we can beef up the phonetics ability for a child and helping him to decode words and encode words and begin to read, and then all of the other lessons becomes much easier, even in math, because most of your lessons are written. If you cannot read or comprehend, you will appear to be unintelligent. But most of our children who are functioning in the community, off of their not just knowledge, but of their wisdom, have the ability to learn. They have good brains, and we cannot write them off as being deficit or damaged brains, because there is no way that all these black boys have damaged brains, and there's no way that these mothers have brought these children into the world under a deficit disorder. So therefore, we have to do some work. Principals, we're going to have to retrain those teachers to help you go in and do reassessments of these misappropriated diagnoses that we have here. Excuse me. There are a lot of misappropriated diagnoses that psychiatrists just diagnose over the phone by way of getting the symptoms, lining them up on a checkoff survey sheet, and then coming back saying, yes, the child is attention deficit disorder. No longer can we have those types of evaluations. They're inappropriate and they're not conclusive. And I know enough about conclusive studies to have worked with pathologists in pathology labs with cystology and histology. You must be conclusive in your findings. And you cannot underdiagnose someone when you're not performing proper tests. One of the things that I like to see happen, I like to see those districts give me a phone call. I've worked with NABI long enough in the area of English as a new language learner. I am skilled in their curriculum and going into the district to do a reassessment of those inappropriate candidates who might have ended up in special ed, who should be in a language program. And it's not just for Hispanics and for the foreigners who come here and refugees to get all this learning that we have in language. It's also for the African American child who was never taught to read properly and who was prevented from reading and who never had a chance to learn phonetics and Ebonics. So now they have been using Ebonics so long, it becomes a regularized code, and we must acknowledge it and do the remediation for those children who are not reading. I'm willing to bet you that every one of those children in special ed are non-readers. And it's not because they're unintelligent, it's because they've never been taught to read. And when taught properly how to read, they can stay in the mainstream and never have to go to special ed again. And boy, don't we have a serious issue here if we find that we are going to continue on this path and putting every black boy in the special ed who don't need anything but remediation for reading and language. And I hate to say it, principals, but are we doing everything we can do to go back over with the fine-tooth comb and find those ones that are lost? Because I found some geniuses in special ed who shouldn't have been there in the first place. And principals, you need to have that kind of eye where you can see the same thing and turn it around. What are we doing to turn it around? Parents, you can also help too by leading up these caravans to reassess those children in special ed and giving them their own IEPs and not boilerplate IEPs so that they will have a lesson plan that will address their inability to read. Because that's where most of the young boys in prison end up, is in prison because they don't understand and they can't comprehend reading. And that is one of the main reasons why they end up in prison, because their lack of inability to read. Are they purposely not teaching black boys how to read? I don't understand it. Every black boy that I had in my presence who wanted to learn to read, learned to read. They didn't come there saying, I'm refusing to read. They all want to learn to read. So why can't these teachers teach them to read? What is the problem? Have they been given other instructions to make sure they don't teach them to read? Inquiry minds want to know. But we have to look at, we got to turn these school systems around. And we might have to do this with people who have a neutral grounds like our private industry who's taken over these schools. But these so-called learned people who've been heading up these schools have not done a good job in making sure that all children can read. I know they haven't, because I stayed after school evenings to make sure I gave these children a foundation of phonetic awareness, phonemic awareness, decoding, encoding, and being able to use the murmur diptydrones and the pig pens to be able to decipher how to read any word. Now, taking them on to medical terminology would be a challenge, but I'm feeling in my bone that maybe we should challenge them a little bit higher and go beyond the reading readiness skill to teaching them medical term and then keeping their attention. But we cannot continue on this caravan lying to the communities about how black boys can't learn and be telling them how we have to put them in remediation and special ed. Then you don't even have the specialists there. You have the so-called special ed teachers who don't even teach reading. So the child still gets a deficit and never learns how to read. Why not put them in a class with a teacher with the specialty of a language? Maybe they'll at least learn to read, or you can hold her to it. But what are you holding these special ed teachers to? What is their obligation? If they are a specialist, then they should be able to magnify that child in some area of specialty. But we cannot keep creating pull-out program, push-in program, remediation program, and you're getting nowhere with special ed. But you're gaining all this money for each child. I'm a little appalled at it. That's why I wrote about it, because I want the story to be out there. You must be able to do something with these black male children and teaching them. They're not beyond being taught. It's just you have got to have teachers that are committed to teach them. And where are they? Must we create a new breed of teachers, bring in those black males and show them how to remediate in reading and show you that it can be done? When a child respects someone, they will learn for them. But if they do not respect you, they can refuse to learn from you. But we must create the teacher's pet. I'm the new teacher's pet. Bring me in. Make me your teacher's pet. I will come in and I will see to it that your children learn. If your district wants to hire me out to bring me in to work with those teachers who can't teach reading or don't know how to teach reading to African American children, just let me come in and sing a song or two, and they'll be on to learning how to read for the rest of their life. When two boys go out to play a game, the first one usually says his name. The second one knows he cannot speak. He usually goes to see, sound off, 1, 2. 1, 2. Do it with the drill. Keep their minds going while their physical bodies are going. And they're going to catch on to that reading ability, and you will find that the children will begin to comprehend and read fluently and listening to you read on a regular basis. If you're not reading on a regular basis and they don't hear your voice when you're reading, I guarantee you're going to have a classroom full of non-readers. But if you are articulate and are reading, those children are going to read just like you. Tell me something that I don't know. Tell me why you can get away with every year adding more and more and more black boys to the special ed department and no one challenges you. As if there's an epidemic with black boys, they're just falling prey to being ignorant. Is that right? I don't think so. I think some people don't want to teach black boys, and they're afraid to even waste their time because they're assuming that they don't know anything. You might just be assuming wrong this time, but it's very vital that we get a better understanding of how to turn these classrooms around. A lot of people really do want to turn these classrooms around, but you know what? When I was there, they were playing games. They didn't want me to teach reading. They felt I could use my time doing something else. But how is it that a child could advance to another higher subject when he hasn't even learned the basics of reading? And when we teach the child the basics of unlocking the code and encoding and decoding, then they can read anything at their own free will. When we take away the ability to read, it's like taking away the lifeline of a child. And when you let a child sit there and you say, okay, you don't want to do the encoding, so what? We've got to demand that they have certain obligation to read certain books and to read certain high-frequency words. So where are we going with this? We're going to have a country full of children that cannot read. It was bad enough when the African Americans couldn't read intentionally when you stopped them. Now they have a right to read, and you're still not teaching them to read. This is heresy. And this cannot continue to go on. Make me the teacher's pet. Go on and make me the teacher's pet. I promise you, I'll become the teacher's pet once I teach your children to read and to go to the board and to listen for dictation and to go to the typewriter and to type the words and the sounds that they hear. The first step is teaching the child to have a love for reading and making books come alive to them. And telling stories can be the beginning, and then opening up books at their grade level that they can read. But we certainly can't keep passing them on to special ed and saying, I don't know what's wrong with this child. He's never going to learn to read. That's because you're not reading. If you were reading stories to them on a regular basis, they would have a love for reading. You cannot get away with this anymore. The gig is up. We must point you out, and we must call you out and let the world know that it's not all these children's fault, that some teachers refuse to teach and they must be called out and reprimanded. Yes, the conspiracy to destroy black boys, there is a conspiracy and female teachers are involved. And that includes all of us, because we've all had our hand in making recommendations. Because as soon as we take the job, the first obligation we have is to assess, to screen, and make referrals. And that is part of our job description. And we've made so many referrals and so many mistakes. And they must be overturned. Principals, you can help with that. by bringing in staffs of people like myself to help you to reassess your department, to place those black boys back into the mainstream and giving them a second chance at learning and giving them the help they need and English language learning, and cutting back on some of those special ed departments and making teachers do their jobs in the classroom, and you can eliminate the special education department because there won't be any need for it because the teachers will now be doing remediation reading. That's right. You might have to send them back to school or send them to my class so I can teach them in my language buddy school how to teach reading. This is the first step you have to do, principal, making sure every teacher can teach reading at any level. The child must be remediated by any means necessary. Thank you so much. And this is your buddy coach sounding out. Make me your teacher's pet. You won't regret it. Oh, Dabo and Baba Booey to you, y'all. Straight ahead and into the reading lab. Oh, Dabo.